On January 15th, 2007, in the affluent suburb of Westfield, the discovery of a blood-soaked living room at the home of Helen Whitman filled the quiet community with fear and sorrow. What began as an affair with her elderly neighbor culminated in a gruesome murder that would expose the underbelly of suburban life. The investigation that followed would unravel a web of secrets and lies, leaving no one untouched by the tragedy. It was a chilly Monday afternoon on January 15th, 2007. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the suburban streets of Westfield, New Jersey. The Whitman household, usually brimming with warmth and light, was unusually quiet. Helen Whitman was known to be an early riser who opened her curtains to let in the first light of day. But on this day, the house remained eerily closed off from the outside world. Susan Myers, Helen's next-door neighbor, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Susan and Helen had been casual friends for years, often sharing morning coffee and chatting about their lives. Helen was the kind of person who always seemed to be in control. Her life neatly organized, her home always immaculate. That's why it struck Susan as odd that Helen hadn't opened her curtains, and she hadn't seen her all day. Around 4:30 p.m., after leaving several voicemails and receiving no response, Susan decided to walk over to check on her. She rang the doorbell, but there was no answer. She knocked louder, calling out Helen's name, but the house remained silent. Growing more anxious by the minute, Susan walked around to the side of the house, hoping to find another way to get Helen's attention. As she approached the living room window, her heart began to race. The curtains were drawn, but she could see a small gap where they didn't quite meet in the middle. Peering through the narrow opening, Susan's eyes widened in horror. Inside, the living room was in complete disarray, furniture overturned, and the once pristine white walls were smeared with dark, ominous stains. And there, on the floor, lay Helen, her body twisted unnaturally, a pool of blood spreading beneath her head. Susan stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth as she stifled a scream. Her mind raced as she fumbled for her cell phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice came through the line. Susan's voice quivered as she spoke, barely able to form the words. She told the operator that her neighbor was dead. The operator, maintaining a calm tone, instructed Susan to stay on the line and not to enter the house. Within minutes, the distant sound of sirens grew louder as police cars and an ambulance pulled up to the curb. The quiet neighborhood was soon filled with flashing lights, the once peaceful street now a scene of chaos. This brings us to everything that occurred before Helen's death. Now, the Whitman family was the picture of suburban success. Their home, a stately two-story house with a manicured lawn and white picket fence, was one of the most admired in the neighborhood. Inside, the walls were adorned with family photos, each one telling the story of a seemingly perfect life. Helen Whitman, a 32-year-old housewife, played the role of the devoted wife with effortless grace. Her husband, David Whitman, was a 40-year-old financial advisor whose successful career allowed them to live in comfort and security. To outsiders, their life together seemed ideal, stable, prosperous, and enviable. But as is often the case, appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the surface, Helen's life was anything but perfect. With David frequently traveling for work, Helen spent much of her time alone. The days blurred together, filled with mundane tasks: cleaning, grocery shopping, attending to the garden. As the years passed, the spark that had once ignited her marriage slowly dimmed, leaving her feeling isolated and unfulfilled. The loneliness began to weigh on her, creating a void that grew wider with each of David's business trips. It was during one of these long absences that Helen's life took an unexpected turn. Next door to the Whitmans lived George Sinclair, a 69-year-old retired engineer. George had lost his wife to cancer 5 years earlier, and since then he had lived a quiet, solitary life. Though well regarded in the neighborhood, he kept mostly to himself, tending to his garden and taking long walks through the nearby park. To the residents of Westfield, George was a reserved, polite man, respected but largely unnoticed. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Helen was struggling to carry a heavy bag of groceries into her house, George happened to be passing by. He offered to help, and Helen, grateful for the assistance, invited him in for a cup of tea as a thank you. What began as a simple act of kindness soon developed into something more. They found themselves talking for hours, sharing stories about their lives, their families, and their mutual experiences of loss and loneliness. Helen, starved for companionship, found in George a comforting presence, someone who listened to her in a way that David hadn't in years. As the weeks passed, Helen and George's meetings became more frequent. What started as casual conversations over tea soon evolved into deep, emotionally charged exchanges. George would visit in the afternoons after David had left for work, and the two would sit together in the living room, talking about everything and nothing at all. There was a warmth and understanding between them that felt both new and familiar. A connection that neither had expected but both desperately needed. It wasn't long before their emotional bond turned into something more intimate. One rainy afternoon, as they sat together on the couch, the tension between them became impossible to ignore. Helen, feeling a rush of emotions she hadn't experienced in years, leaned in and kissed George. The kiss was tentative at first, but it quickly deepened, fueled by the pent-up desires that had been building between them for months. From that moment on, their affair became a secret lifeline for Helen, a refuge from the emptiness that had consumed her marriage. Whenever David was away, Helen would eagerly await George's visits, the thrill of their forbidden relationship adding excitement to her otherwise monotonous days. For George, the affair was a rekindling of passions he thought he had lost with his wife's death, a second chance at feeling alive. The day after Helen's body was discovered, Detective Marie Collins arrived at the Whitman residence. It was just after 9 a.m., and the sun was climbing higher in the sky, but the atmosphere around the house remained somber. Detective Collins, a seasoned investigator with over 15 years of experience, was known for her sharp mind and unrelenting pursuit of justice. As she stepped out of her car, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for the gruesome task ahead. The crime scene had been secured overnight, and now it was time to begin the investigation in earnest. As Detective Collins entered the house, she was struck by the silence. The living room, where Helen's body had been discovered, was now a carefully preserved scene of horror. Blood spatter analysis would be crucial in determining what had happened, and every detail would need to be documented. Detective Collins surveyed the room, her trained eyes noting every detail. the broken glass on the floor, the heavy candlestick lying near Helen's body, and the signs of a struggle evident in the overturned furniture. Helen's injuries suggested she had been attacked with considerable force, and the lack of forced entry pointed to the likelihood that she had known her attacker. As the forensic team got to work, Detective Collins walked through the rest of the house. The kitchen was spotless, no signs of a struggle there. The bedrooms upstairs were untouched, their neatness contrasting sharply with the chaos downstairs. It was clear that whatever had happened, it had all taken place in the living room. By early afternoon, the house was swarming with police officers, crime scene investigators, and detectives, all meticulously collecting evidence. As Detective Collins watched them work, her mind began to piece together the possible scenarios. This was no random act of violence. This was personal. Whoever had killed Helen had done so with a level of anger that was chilling. As the days passed, the shock of Helen Whitman's death continued to ripple through the quiet community of Westfield. The police investigation was in full swing, and everyone was anxiously waiting for answers. On the morning of January 20th, 2007, the autopsy results finally came in, providing crucial information about the nature of Helen's death. Dr. Elaine Peters, the medical examiner, had spent hours meticulously examining Helen's body. The results confirmed that Helen had died from severe head trauma, but the weapon used was not what the police initially suspected. Instead of the heavy candlestick found near her body, it was a trophy that had been used to deliver the fatal blow. Her husband's high school trophy, found sitting next to the fireplace, its shape matched the injuries on Helen's skull perfectly. The blow had been delivered with such force that it caused a skull fracture, leading to a massive brain hemorrhage. Helen had died almost instantly. But the autopsy revealed more than just the cause of death. There were also signs of a struggle. Helen had defensive wounds on her arms, indicating that she had tried to fend off her attacker. Bruises on her wrists suggested that she had been grabbed and restrained at some point during the attack. It was clear that whoever had killed Helen had done so in a fit of rage, and the evidence pointed to someone close to her. Simultaneously, the forensic team had been combing through the crime scene and analyzing every piece of evidence they could find. As they carefully dusted for fingerprints and examined the blood spatter, they discovered something that would turn the case on its head. On the trophy, they found fingerprints that matched George Sinclair. More damning still, traces of Helen's blood were found on the cuffs of George's shirt, which he had been wearing on the day of the murder. When questioned about the bloodstains, George tried to explain them away. He claimed that a few days before Helen's death, she had accidentally cut herself while cooking, and in her panic, he had helped her clean up. But this explanation did little to quell the growing suspicions. The blood on George's shirt wasn't consistent with a small kitchen injury. It was evidence of something much more violent. Detective Collins laid out the evidence in front of George: the fingerprints on the trophy, the blood on his shirt, the signs of a struggle. The once composed and quiet man now sat with his hands trembling, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. George had already admitted to the affair, but now he was being confronted with something far more serious. "George, the evidence is clear," Detective Collins began, her voice calm but firm. "We know you were at Helen's house that day. We know you had a relationship with her that went beyond friendship. And we know that your fingerprints are on the weapon that killed her. We need you to tell us the truth." George's face turned pale, and for a moment, it seemed as if he might collapse under the weight of it all. But then, with a deep, shuddering breath, he began to speak, his voice breaking as he recounted what had happened. "I loved her," George said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I never wanted this to happen." He explained that on the afternoon of January 15th, he had gone to visit Helen, as he often did when David was away. But this time, things were different. Helen had been distant, preoccupied, and when George pressed her about what was wrong, she finally admitted that she wanted to end their affair. She told him that it had gone too far, that it was dangerous, and that she could no longer continue living a lie. Helen insisted that she loved her husband, despite the distance that had grown between them, and that she needed to fix her marriage. George was devastated. The thought of losing Helen, the one person who had brought light back into his life after his wife's death, was unbearable. He had pleaded with her, begged her to reconsider, but Helen was resolute. She told him it was over and that he needed to leave. In a fit of desperation and anger, George snapped. As Helen turned her back on him to walk away, he grabbed the fireplace poker from its stand and, in a moment of blind rage, struck her on the back of the head. Helen stumbled, falling forward onto the coffee table, but George, overwhelmed by his emotions, struck her again and again until she lay still. It wasn't until he saw the blood pooling around her head that George realized what he had done. The woman he claimed to love was lying lifeless before him, and the reality of his actions hit him like a tidal wave. Panicked, George dropped the poker and fled the scene, hoping against hope that somehow no one would connect him to the crime. But now, sitting in the interrogation room, George knew there was no escaping what he had done. As Detective Collins listened to his confession, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. It was clear that George was a man who had lost control, driven by emotions he could no longer contain. But that didn't change the fact that he had committed a brutal, unforgivable crime. By the end of January, with George's confession and the mountain of evidence against him, Detective Collins had all she needed to make an arrest. On the morning of January 30th, 2007, George Sinclair was formally charged with second-degree murder. The once quiet and unassuming man was led out of his home in handcuffs, his head bowed as reporters and neighbors watched in stunned silence. The community was in shock. How could the kindly old man, who had been a fixture in their neighborhood for years, be capable of such a heinous act? The trial of George Sinclair became the talk of Westfield, capturing the attention of the entire town. Every day, the courtroom was packed with residents eager to hear the latest developments in the case that had shattered their quiet community. The media flocked to the small town, turning what had once been a local scandal into a story that reached far beyond the borders of Westfield. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting a strong, compelling case against George Sinclair. They painted him as a man driven by obsession and jealousy, a man who had lost control when Helen Whitman tried to end their affair. According to the prosecution, George had become infatuated with Helen, seeing her as the only light in his otherwise lonely life. When she told him it was over, he couldn't accept the rejection. The prosecution argued that this rejection sent George into a fit of rage, leading him to grab the nearest object, a heavy candlestick, and strike Helen with deadly force. The evidence presented was damning. George's fingerprints were found on the candlestick, and Helen's blood was on his clothing. The prosecution also highlighted the motive. A man who had nothing left to lose, driven to the brink by the thought of losing the woman he loved. However, the defense was equally determined to prove George's innocence. They argued that the case against George was circumstantial and that the prosecution had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that George was the killer. The defense presented an alternative theory, suggesting that George was being framed. They pointed to the possibility that someone else could have killed Helen, someone who had an even stronger motive, her husband, David Whitman. David Whitman, a successful financial advisor, had been away on a business trip when Helen was murdered. He had a busy career, often traveling and spending long hours at work, which had contributed to the distance growing between him and Helen. The defense suggested that David had found out about the affair weeks before Helen's death. According to their theory, David's discovery of the affair had shattered him. He felt betrayed by the woman he had devoted his life to, and the knowledge that she had been unfaithful with their elderly neighbor filled him with anger and humiliation. In late December 2006, just weeks before Helen's death, David had confronted her about the affair. He had come across an email exchange between Helen and George, a series of messages that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. When David confronted Helen, it led to a heated argument. He was furious, feeling that his trust had been broken, and he threatened to divorce her. The prospect of losing her marriage, the life she had built, and the security it provided terrified Helen. She begged David not to leave, promising to end the affair immediately. David, still enraged, agreed to stay, but the tension between them remained palpable. It was this argument, the defense argued, that led Helen to end things with George on the day of her murder. But in the defense's narrative, it wasn't George who was unable to handle the rejection. It was David who couldn't let go of his anger. They suggested that after Helen's confession, David had planned his revenge. On the day of the murder, he could have returned home unexpectedly, confronting Helen in a final, violent confrontation. David had been out of town when the murder took place, which, according to the defense, provided him with a perfect alibi. But the defense argued that David's business trip could have been a cover, allowing him to slip away, commit the crime, and return without raising suspicion. The defense suggested that David's fingerprints could have been on the candlestick, and any traces of blood on his clothing could have been cleaned up before he was questioned. After all, as Helen's husband, he had easy access to the crime scene. Adding to the defense's theory was the fact that David hadn't contacted Helen while he was away. Normally, he would have called her at least once a day, even if just for a quick check-in. But in the days leading up to her death, David didn't call at all. The defense implied that David was still furious with Helen, refusing to speak to her as a way of punishing her for her betrayal. It wasn't until the police contacted him after Helen's body was discovered that David even knew something had happened. This, the defense suggested, was suspicious behavior for a husband who was supposedly unaware of the danger his wife was in. Throughout the trial, the defense worked to cast doubt on the prosecution's case, suggesting that David Whitman, not George Sinclair, had the strongest motive to kill Helen. They pointed to the bitter argument between the couple, David's knowledge of the affair, and his cold behavior in the days before the murder, as evidence that he could have been the one to strike the fatal blow. But the prosecution countered this narrative by emphasizing the forensic evidence linking George to the crime. They argued that George's confession, the fingerprints on the murder weapon, and the blood on his clothes were incontrovertible proof of his guilt. They also questioned why David, who had an airtight alibi, would risk everything by murdering his wife when he could have simply divorced her and walked away. As the trial progressed, the courtroom was filled with tension, the audience hanging on every word. The community, once united in their shock over Helen's death, was now divided. Some believed in George's guilt, convinced by the physical evidence and his own confession. Others couldn't ignore the possibility that David, the scorned husband, might have been capable of such a crime. After weeks of testimony, the jury reached a verdict. On March 2, 2007, George Sinclair was found guilty of second-degree murder. The evidence, particularly the fingerprints on the murder weapon and the bloodstains on his clothing, is too compelling to ignore. George is sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. As the verdict is read, George collapses in tears, still proclaiming his innocence. The tragic end of Helen Whitman and the downfall of George Sinclair serve as a painful reminder of the devastating consequences of hidden desires and unchecked emotions. But this isn't the only crime story where foolish desires resulted in the death of someone. The case of Housewife's Secret Affair. Her father-in-law is another example of this, where one stupid decision resulted in a roller coaster of tragedy.